It's a great pleasure, excuse me, to introduce our keynote speaker, Joy Ito. Over the past 30 years, Joy has been recognized around the world for his work as an activist, an entrepreneur, and for his advocacy of emergent democracy, privacy, and internet freedom. During this time, he has made Time Magazine's list of cyber elite and has been named one of the 25 most influential people on the web by Business Week, among other recognitions. He's also served as both board chair and CEO of Creative Commons, currently sits on the boards of the New York Times Company, the Knight Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and Sony Corporation. As director of the MIT Media Lab, Joy explores how radical new approaches to science and technology can transform society in substantial and positive ways. Joy has been a past attendee of SIGGRAPH, and it is a great honor to have him back as our keynote speaker. Please welcome Mr. Joy Ito.
It really is kind of interesting and great to be back. I was trying to remember when I was last here, and then I saw Uncle Fuchs and the VR stuff, and I remembered it was around the last time that VR was a thing. And I remember it was back when we had rave flyers that said free VR on it, and it was like, so it's interesting that it's coming again. And so it feels like an interesting homecoming for me with a lot of deja vu. But the Media Lab has been sort of in different waves, has always been here. I know Ramesh is on the executive committee, Hiroshi, who's here, is often here. So we've had a long and fruitful relationship with SIGGRAPH, and I wanted to talk, but I think some of you may not know the Media Lab that well, and it's continuously changing, so I'll describe it a little bit. The Media Lab is a lab inside of MIT. It's kind of a unique lab because in most of MIT you have this kind of weird matrix where you have sort of academics on one side and you have labs on the other. Academics have the sort of academic power, and the labs control the research and the money, and they sort of, there's a natural tension between having to do your classes versus having to do the fun research. And so we, when we got set up 30 years ago by Jerome Wiesner and Nicholas Negroponte, they decided to create a program, an academic program inside of the lab so that we could eliminate almost all lectures and have the research itself be the learning. So we often say we learn through construction rather than instruction. And it's also a strange program because it's a master's and PhD program underneath the School of Architecture because it's spun out of the Architecture Machine Group, which sort of makes sense, and that even ties it very closely kind of to the history of SIGGRAPH. But it's very broad, so we call it the Media Lab, and the program is Media Arts and Sciences. But when we say media, and this is my own sort of reinterpretation of it, media is plural for medium, which is anything you can express yourself in, whether that's cities or DNA or opera or computer graphics. We have 24 different groups. Ramesh and Hiroshi, for instance, are heads of each of those groups, and each of the groups accepts students directly, so you don't apply to the Media Lab. And so we have a very diverse set of faculty. We try to always hire faculty that are somewhat orthogonal to things that we do, that somehow relate to things that we do. But the key thing is that because we're a relatively small lab, we have in 24 faculty, about 150 grad students, we try to only do things that no one else would do. And so we recently did a faculty search, and we've used this word before, but one of the requirements for this search was that they had to be anti-disciplinary. And what that means is it's different from interdisciplinary, because interdisciplinary is when you have sort of the chemistry guys and the computer graphics guys talking to each other. Anti-disciplinary is that space that's between or beyond the disciplines, stuff that just doesn't fit in anywhere else. So, and one thing, we only hire assistant professors without tenure, because we like to try to invest in people who wouldn't otherwise get that investment. So almost as a rule, I don't like faculty who could get a job anywhere else. That was actually on the faculty admissions. If you could get a job in any other academic institution, please don't apply. We also say if somebody else would fund what you want to do as a starting faculty member, you don't need us. And so what we do is we tend to fund assistant professors, and by the time they get up to tenure, they've sort of developed a whole new field, and then sometimes they move on and continue to do other things. But But antidisciplinary is actually pretty interesting and important because I think at some level this is what SIGGRAPH is about as well. I love this picture by Rich Gold, and this is a picture that he drew of the sort of 4 hats that he wore, right? And so sometimes he was an artist, sometimes he was a scientist, sometimes he was a designer, sometimes he was an engineer. To this crowd, I don't think I have to explain the difference. In some crowds, I have to explain the difference between art and engineering, and they're obviously different. We can go on for hours about the differences. One of my favorite definitions from the head of the Mori Art Museum the other day, because he was talking about what is art, and he said, well, art is anything as long as it's not useful. And then you have sort of designers that are ultimately trying to connect things to society, and you have the engineers who build things and the scientists who go off. And we'll talk more about this, but one of the things I wanted to say on this slide was that, and this is sort of a conversation we often have at the Media Lab, is that if you think about those fields where all of these were either in the same person or at least in the same room, like photography, like computer graphics, where you had the artists talking to the engineers, and they evolve and develop in a really sort of wonderful way. And those fields, and I hope I don't insult anybody here, but if you take things like print or motion pictures, and with New York Times and Sony, I'm sort of guilty of both of this, which is that you get the professionals making the tools separate from the artists. And then you start to get this kind of atrophying of creativity, where you sort of set and lock in, like motion pictures, you start to lock in certain types of modalities, and you don't see that active development. So I think that SIGGRAPH has always been, to me, the place where the artists and the engineers and the designers and the scientists all come together and often are in the same person. And I think a lot of the award winners would be those types of people. And so this is what we strive for at the Media Lab. We want every student and every faculty member to sort of walk in and walk out sort of feeling like they need to be all of these at some level. But as I said in the intro, I started at the Media Lab recently. Before that, as a juvenile, I swam a couple layers lower than many of you application and content people. I swam in the IP layer. And in the IP layer, I think about the world through the lens of the internet. So let me talk about the internet for a second. So first of all, I can sort of see, how many of you don't remember when the internet didn't exist? So there's a post-internet people. So okay, so there's a few. But most of us, I think, remember before internet. So try to remember back before the internet was here, right? It was a very different world. So I call that BI, before internet. And so before internet, life was slow. Things were relatively predictable. Moore's law was starting, but it wasn't sort of in full force. And you could sort of go to school, learn something, and then the rest of your life, whether you're a banker or a variety of other things, your job was sort of rinse and repeat after you left school. And things were not so complicated. Economists could actually predict the future sometimes before the internet, right? And then you have AI, which is after internet, and then suddenly the world becomes extremely complex. Those rules that we had, those Newtonian-like laws, turned out to be local ordinances that actually don't work in general situations. And you didn't replace those rules with other rules. The world just became impossibly difficult to predict, very fast and interconnected. And in this world, a certain category of people and organizations and schools and companies thrived. Some died, and some sort of managed to maintain some sort of equilibrium. But it's a very different world. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened. And again, you could replace this with like high-speed computation or your favorite thing that happened around sort of the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. This was my bathroom in the beginning of the 90s. This is because the Cisco router was so noisy and it was so hot, the ventilation in the bath worked very well. But this was the first commercial internet service provider in Japan. It's about $2,000 of junk parts that I bought off of Unet. And it's that Sun Spark, the VT100 terminal, only half of the display worked, and the Spark, the fan ran out, and I had a client's data on the hard disk, and all of us took turns blowing on the hard disk until we could go get the fan. But so this is, in the internet language, we used to call this best effort, right? And the thing is, though, a couple things going on here. So this is permissionless innovation. This is the first time a bunch of nerds and hackers in their bathroom could compete with a telephone company, which would probably spend millions of dollars trying to do the same thing. We could get junk parts, and we were allowed to just connect things together because the protocols were so lightweight and available to students. And then what this did is also dramatically lower the cost of collaboration and communication because we were forced, the phone companies were forced to compete with us. So this is significant because it took communications cost from prohibitive to reasonable, right? And that changed everything. So you add to that Moore's Law, and what you get is, first of all, you get free and open source software for the first time exploding. I mean, Richard will tell you that it happened way before the internet, but the real explosion of free and open source software happened when the collaboration costs went down to nearly zero, and the distribution costs go to nearly zero, and so you get the whole stack on the computer, and you get the network, and what you end up with a low cost of innovation, or you can call it invention, or whatever word you want to replace it with, but that's materially different, and let me try to describe why. And we all know this, but I just want to reiterate this in a different way. So if you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a system like the old Minitel systems, or each telephone company had their own version of kind of like the internet, where they built the whole stack themselves. They put the wires in, they put the hardware in, they wrote all this whole stack of the software, and then they tried to gather content. These things cost hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, so you needed a person to plan it, usually an MBA with a suit, and then they would get the money either from a bank or from the phone company, and then they would deploy designers and engineers to build the thing. And we still do this with high cost, high risk, low risk tolerant sort of things. But what the internet did with the stack is, if you look at Google, Facebook, and Yahoo, they didn't have to build the whole stack. They could buy an off-the-shelf PC, put Linux in it, put a whole LAMP stack in it, and write a little bit of software on top, and then they could compete with everybody. And if you think about Google, Facebook, and Yahoo, they were all created before they raised money. So this is pretty key, because if you have to write a plan to raise the money to get the thing, that means you have to ask somebody for permission. You have to sell somebody on the idea. But if you can actually build the first working prototype of your thing, or actually working deployment of the thing without any money, that means you don't have to ask anybody for permission. And in Silicon Valley, what you do is you chase people who have already built things with money, rather than sitting in your position of power, sort of giving permission to students and researchers to do this. And so this is why Boston lost its regional advantage to Silicon Valley. Because Boston had big computer companies who had lots of money and lots of permission and lots of authority. And it turns out in permissionless innovation, authority and money don't help you that much. It actually scares away the kids to places like Silicon Valley, where they just do whatever they want, and the money chases them around. So this is MBA-driven innovation. This is engineer, designer-driven innovation. So we all know this happened on the internet, okay, and this happened with software. So I'm going to make an argument that it's not just that. So this is a little story about what happened to me. I was in Boston interviewing for my Media Lab job on March 11th, and that's when the big earthquake happened in Japan. So I was very worried about the radiation coming out of in a cloud, fallout heading towards my house. So I wanted to get a Geiger counter, but I couldn't find one online. So I started reaching out, and Ray Ozzie had just left Microsoft, so he was available. I found some people from IDEO working on a web page. I found the guy who had done the monitoring system for 3 Mile Island, and just through kind of pulling people together across the internet, I was able to put together a pretty interesting ragtag team within a week or two. And so then we convened in Tokyo, and then we decided, first of all, we can build Geiger counters, but we're going to run out of these sensors, because there's only one company in New York called LND that made these 2-inch pancakes. So we had to go mobile. So we built them for cars, and we drove around. We got a bunch of volunteers, started driving around. And then we were able to map. We currently now have 30 million data points. They're all open. Being head of Creative Commons, I'm very in favor of open data. But we're now the largest open data set for this kind of project. And it's a completely sort of bottom-up, not heavily funded volunteer project. And now we're switching to things like air quality and other things. But what was interesting, my point here, is that there were all these government plans and NGOs that were supposed to try to figure out what to do after the earthquake, and all these plans, they all failed. And we started after the earthquake. We were able to grab the people that we needed, and so we, John C. Brown likes to use the term the power of pull. So we were able to pull things from the network as we needed them, rather than having to plan, stock, and prepare. And again, this is a lot like these other things, where the cost of preparation is very low, and you actually just pull things together. And you should map it onto education too. Instead of stocking your students full of knowledge and skills, maybe you should have them understand how to organize, how to ask questions, how to think about context. And so I think it's an example, and it shows that the internet isn't just for software. You can do hardware. So we had a lot of local NGOs starting, and we ran around. But we also designed this little device, and this won an award. But if you look inside, it's a bunch of Arduino boards and some open source pieces, and there's a little bit of innovation around sort of the high voltage stuff that you have to do, analog technology you have to deal with the Geiger counter, and there's some firmware. But most of that stuff is actually open hardware, and it's just sitting in a Pelican case, right? So, and then later, Bunny Huang, one of our researchers, designed a brand new Geiger counter, because Geiger counters don't get much design love. So he made one that looked kind of nice. And we open source, so this is the open hardware mark, but we made it available online. So anybody can download it and design and build a fairly nice Geiger counter. And this is sort of the point I wanted to make on this slide, is that now with rapid prototyping and with open hardware, it's starting to look a little bit more like software. Obviously, the cost of distribution is still physical, but the cost of developing and designing is starting to go down dramatically because of the same reasons. So this is Limor. She was also a former Media Labber. She's in New York, and she's standing in front of what she calls her favorite gadget. And it's a Samsung pick-and-place machine that, as many of you know, it very high speeds puts little electrical components onto PCBs. It's a little factory in a box. And if you think about the equivalent, it's like Amazon's really good at running data centers, so they sell cloud services. This is kind of like, okay, Samsung's really good at making very effective, efficient manufacturing equipment. They sell it in a box, and she can buy it on the internet, and she can run a factory. So in New York, without raising any money, she's growing very quickly. She has thousands of products that she designs herself, she manufactures herself, she ships herself, and she is a small but very vibrant manufacturing organization. But as there's a Silicon Valley for internet, there is a Shenzhen for hardware. So we've been sending students to Shenzhen. We have several projects at the Media Lab now in sort of millions scales of volume. So we are now going into manufacturing. Nicholas and others at the Media Lab had a very famous saying, which was, instead of traditional academia, which was publish or perish, the Media Lab was about deploy or die. And, no, demo or die. And we changed it recently to deploy or die. Because in the old days, kids couldn't go to Shenzhen and go into manufacturing. We had to sort of induce our sponsors to make things like Lego Mindstorms or the Kindle. But now we can go to Shenzhen and build the stuff ourselves. And it's amazing. If you've ever been there, there is almost nothing you can't build. No one will say no, and if they can't do it, their uncle's factory can do it, and you can get almost any part at any volume within hours, and it's just an amazingly innovative place. They don't really care that much about IP yet, which is kind of interesting, because you see a lot of knowledge flowing in their own version of open source. But if you think about it, I mean, I remember one of the early Honda engineers that I met said that when he used to come to Detroit, he carried a little measuring tape in his pocket, would measure the equipment, and then go back and build I think a lot of innovators start with copying. But what I will say is, I think that the Shenzhen innovators have caught up, and a lot of the stuff that they're doing. And there's also this interesting phenomenon when people catch up but don't realize they're actually ahead. And so they're in that little weird moment where a lot of the engineers in Shenzhen are actually ahead of their counterparts in these big companies. And I think they're going to pivot to where they're going to be designing and developing things that we can't even imagine yet. But the thing is that they innovate on this hardware like we innovate on software. I mean, it only takes them a couple hours to sort of retool and go. It costs about $1,000 to do a whole retooling. It's just incredibly effective. And this is on Bunny's blog, but this is a $9 retail phone with a 5 megabyte MP3 player, OLED screen, quad band GSM, lithium battery, Bluetooth. It's $9. You can't design this anywhere else in the world, and it's somebody who understands the manufacturing process completely. And if you look carefully, there are like no screws. It's a beautiful, and by the way, no one in China uses this. It's too cheap. They send these to developing countries in in other places, because China is starting to get more opulent. But this is interesting because what's happening is that the manufacturing process, like our designers are standing in the factories, and so what's happening is there's a huge amplification that happens when the designers understand the manufacturing process. And so we often say you're not a true designer unless you have tooling grease under your nails. The designers aren't necessarily the engineers, but they understand the process and it's integrated. And this tight coupling of bringing the factory into the designer and the designer into the factory, I think is really important. And historically, we used to do this more. But I think as we've sort of abstracted the layers, it's happening less. But I think there's something to bringing that together. But my point on all of this is I think that what's happening in hardware isn't exactly the same as what happened in software, but is similar, where you're seeing Kickstarter and other sorts of projects getting better. You're starting to see real innovation happening in hardware, and a lot of it is being driven by Shenzhen. This is, I'm going to now pivot to biology. This is Sorona, which is a polyester that's developed by DuPont, and it converts sugar from plants to polyester, and it's about 30% more efficient than the equivalent process, which uses fossil fuels. And it's extremely effective, so effective that the fossil fuel plants are starting to shut down. The problem is this took $400 million and 7 years to build, so it's sort of reminiscent of big computer companies, right? But it's an interesting idea that you can synthetically design microbes to do things that otherwise would have taken a lot more energy or would have been more inefficient. So if you think about Moore's law, we design circuits and schematics, then we go into a fab and manufacture them into a chip, and then we make them into a phone. And this process kept getting better and better, and so we get this high-speed, lower cost. So there's an equivalent sort of process in synthetic biology where we're starting to identify all the little gene sequences and put them into blocks of functions so that they look like editable code. And then you can go to the computer and you can put them together and try to guess, just kind of like how you try to guess whether your computer program is going to do what you think. You do the same thing with genetic code. Obviously, there's maybe slightly more dangerous side effects. And then you stick them into a bacteria or a yeast, and you reboot the thing, and then it will hopefully do what you think it will do, which can be a variety of things. And this process is getting better and better. This is an example of one of our students, Charles Fracchia. But I just wanted to give you this. This is just an interesting example. So he's got a little bacteria. He's added a little plasmid, which is some executable genetic code that will run once it's sort of sucked in by the bacteria. This little hook thing is called a promoter, and it's looking for sucrose, for sugar in the environment. And if it finds it, it will trigger an expression of a gene that will take the potassium from inside the cell and inject it to the environment, which changes the voltage of the surrounding environment. That voltage is picked up by an electrical sensor, which then sends a wireless signal to a computer. And so what this is doing is it's using the microbe as the sensor, and the voltage is the way that the microbes communicate with the electronics. Now, you could make this whole thing in solid state, but first of all, it would be less energy efficient. And also that little promoter, that sucrose, you can just take that biobrick out and put in something for some other material, and suddenly you have a sensor for some other material. So it's actually easier to reprogram the biological device for different materials than it is to reprogram a solid state device. But for the amplification to wireless, that obviously you don't want to use with biology. But to him, biology and electronics have become fungible. Right? You could go either way. And this is sort of public knowledge, but George Church, who we work with, he's a geneticist at Harvard, he now has a gig from Technicolor. So what he did was he was able to use the base pairs in chromosomes as bits to encode his whole book into bacteria and then like shake it up and have it multiply. He was on Colbert. And so then Technicolor heard about this, and he's asking whether we can archive movies in DNA, because they're actually more dense, and they actually cost less money to keep for longer. So as an archival medium, they might be interesting, or even as sensors. So biology as electrical devices is not really that unheard of. And so this is where you're starting to feel, biology may not be that far away from the things that you're interested in. The costs are going down. George Church will argue that the rate of the decrease of cost or the increase of speed sort of broadly in bioengineering is about 4 or 5 times Moore's law. It's a complicated set of arguments that I'm happy to share with people if they're interested. This is so if you remember 2003, it cost $3 billion to sequence the human genome. With this device, it's about $1,000. This came out last month, is Oxford Nanopore's MinION. This device itself costs $1,000. Now, it doesn't do the whole genome sequencing, but it can actually read and analyze all kinds of molecules, including DNA, so you can do a lot of sequencing work with it. So and it just sticks into the USB on your computer, and they were using this in the field to look at Ebola. So the cost of these devices for sequencing are going down. This is Joe Jacobson in our lab. So right now, when you ask for this gene sequence to be printed, you could do it yourself, or you send it to a factory in China where they will sit and do pipettes and put them together by hand. But they get about 1 error per 100 base pairs. So if you think about, if you remember transistor radios where people wired them by hand, there's definitely a yield problem beyond which you can't produce because the cost goes up because the error rates increase. So with this device, we've got 1 error per 10,000 base pairs, and within the year or so, we should have the world's gene printing capacity in this lab. So the printing side is taking off. This is a funny company that I recently found and invested in, so I'm a little biased, but there are a bunch of computer graphics and data analysis guys, and said, well, what if we could just program the experiments themselves? So you could do a wet lab in the cloud. And so this suddenly makes a lot of experiments reproducible because you can go and audit it, and robots run the experiment. And so in addition to being able to share the data with somebody, you can actually share the whole process. They can run the thing, maybe change the temperature. So this is starting to abstract out all of that physical pipetting and turning it into a robotic system so that you literally do have a lab in the cloud. And as you can imagine, more and more of these companies are populated by electrical engineers, by roboticists, by computer scientists, and less by traditional biologists. This is my kitchen, so you can go the other direction, which is very scrappy. So this is what we're doing here is we had a little kit that was delivered to us that had the different genetic building blocks to create the enzymes to produce, using tryptophan, produce a thing called violacin, which is a very expensive anti-cancer material that costs about $350,000 a gram that you can find in the Amazon. So what they did was they sent it to about 500 labs like ours. We all designed our own versions of it, and then we assembled it using this really clever technique using pipettes. And then you stick it into a little solution with viable bacteria, and then you heat shock it. And when you heat shock bacteria, it sucks the DNA from around it into itself. And then you get a certain population of the bacteria who, when rebooted, are running your little program. And the good thing about violacin is it's purple. So you would put it in a petri dish, you can see how purple it is, and you put it on your open lab book. And then we can look at everybody's lab books and see who got the most purple petri dishes. And then we can look at each other's processes and designs. And what we're doing is we're crowdsourcing the best violacin factory by using a bunch of amateurs. Half of these kids have never done synthetic biology. Some of them are artists, some of them are designers. But we were able to actually participate in a fairly important scientific process. Now, a few decades ago, this would have been a Nobel Prize. Now you can just get it in a kit. And it's actually, I think I may have been breaking a law here in doing recombinant DNA without a license. But the thing is, though, that it's become safe enough so that it's kitchen safe. But some of the regulations that academic institutions require, this would probably require BL2, actually. Sorry. This is, iGEM is the International Genetically Engineered Machines project, and this is a spin out of MIT. And this is thousands of kids get together every year for a jamboree where they, it's kind of like the robot competitions, except this is DNA, where they, some kid comes with, E. coli that smells like bananas and winter mints, or some device that helps find landmines. But now we have high school kids actually tinkering with DNA like we used to tinker with chemistry sets or erector sets. And so this is becoming very democratized. I can tell some of you may be scared about this. There's an interesting thing that happened. So we call this street biology, and the first real street biology conference that was held, where they had the street biologists from around the world come in, it was actually hosted by the FBI. And there was an agent there who made a very interesting comment, because I remember the other side. He said, we screwed up on the internet, where we turned the young kids into hackers and we turned them against us by making them sort of bad guys. So we want to work with you, and it's actually harder to defend than it is to sort of screw things up. And they've become an active member of our community. And the street bio kids, when you talk to them, they're sitting around, not all of them, but many of them are sitting around, okay, how do we create a kill switch for this kind of thing? How do we create a monitoring thing for this? And you do see the kids very engaged in trying to figure out how to do this safely. So again, there's no guarantee that we will be able to prevent an extinction event, but I think having the kids on our side is going to give us a much better chance of surviving a mistake than a bunch of big labs. But the problem and the opportunities, it's going to happen. It's like there's a path, and there are these discoveries that are happening, whether you're talking about CRISPR gene drives that allow things in the wild to create children that are all getting genes from one parent, and all kinds of things. But these will keep popping out at a faster and faster rate, so you can't put that back into the bottle. So we need to figure out how to deal with this, and a lot of this will be how do we get young people to understand it and to think about it in the right way. So I'm going to now pivot back. The last sort of series was just trying to make the point that as the cost of innovation goes down in software, hardware, and now biology, you will see the innovation going from the large institutions with the authority and money to the streets, to the garages, to the high schools, to the kids, and we're seeing that across the board, and it's accelerating. This is going to be whiplash-like because it's happening faster than it did with the internet. Now, we just had a faculty retreat, and Neri Oxman in our lab sketched this thing, and it's a little bit hard to parse, but it's based on that rich gold image that you saw earlier, right? So you see art, science, design, and engineering. But if you look at it, you have culture on the left, right? And you've got nature on the right. You've got perception on the top, and you've got production at the bottom. So you think of design as production culture. You can think of engineering as production nature, science as production perception nature, art as perception culture. Then you can look at those green blocks as the currencies. So this was actually inspired by the Krebs cycle. So you can start sort of anywhere, but you could say the artists will convert culture and turn it into perception, which may be viewed as data or information, that then scientists can take that inspiration from nature into nature and convert it into knowledge, and the engineers can take the knowledge and turn that into function. You can take that function and the designers turn it into useful behavior in cultures. And you have little loops too. So you can see from design, you have affirmative design, which is very utilitarian. That hangs out near the design function part. You have like critical design that like Tony and Fiona really pioneered at RCA. That's kind of where design and user and use come in. But you also can collapse and have these weird lenses where when science and design come together, they do an interesting thing, and when art and engineering come together. And this is a little bit academic, but we sort of push this out to the faculty, and I ask them to think about, in their own groups, sort of what are the things that fit together and how are they mashed up, because I wanted to try to sort of get a sense of how we thought about where people sat along this curve. And again, back to the original point, I think the more of this you can encompass in a conversation or a group, the more rich the conversation is. But it is kind of a framework that we're playing with. So on this, I'd love to get your feedback later if people have ideas. So I wanted to just go through, so I gave homework to a couple of our PIs, so you can sort of see how we're trying to apply this. So this is Tangible Media Group run by Hiroshi Shi, who's here. And so he's thinking about how art inspires, science transforms, design embodies, and philosophy envisions. And if you've heard him talk, he talks about radical atoms, which are sort of the taking bits and turning them into atoms and making atoms sort of like graphics of data. And so this is just an example of one of his recent works, which some of you may have seen. But he's really trying to make information physical. Another group, Object-Based Media, run by Mike Bobe. So he's sort of, I think his work's been in and out of here for a while. One of the things he's been working on for a long time is 3D and in particular holography. And we've got this thing that he calls the Mark V, I guess, where now we have an iPhone-sized image. So it's kind of like the Princess Leia size, but it's full color, full motion holography. It's still not big enough, but the next version hopefully will be big enough to do something. But this is a video of, well, this is sort of his space here. And the video that you'll see is some work that he's been doing. This is actually using a Z-space card. So if you look at, you actually have parallax, so you can look around the objects. And the idea is that you have a sort of a holographic experience where you can collaborate. And hopefully the next version of this will be doing using the next version of his holographic device. It is pretty hard to figure out, do you need holography, and in what case you need holography, so we're sort of playing around with this. And responsive environments is Joe Paradiso's work, and these are his sort of Venn diagram that he came up with. He is working a lot, well, we call him the sensor guy, but he's a little bit more than that. So this is Tidmarsh, which is a cranberry bog that's now being sort of decommissioned, and it's now reverting to nature. So we have hundreds of sensors spread out to try to monitor this. And so we're monitoring everything from humidity to illumination to temperature, and then we also have a lot of microphones, so you can sort of walk around in the space. So there's sort of an artistic element where it's a world you can go and experience. You can also go back in history, and we're trying to visualize all the data so you can see this. And so we're also working with people like the Environmental Defense Fund and other people who want to figure out how to create networks of sensors at low cost that can be communicated. So these can be sent out and left there for years. But the idea is how do you instrument the environment? And this is very SIGGRAPH-like in that we were involving environmental scientists and artists and engineers, and it's a bunch of kids doing some cool stuff and using graphics engines that you guys have built. Camera Culture is Ramesh's group, and he said he has newer work, but I'm going to show my favorite work. So this is kind of his Venn diagram, and I think many of you may have already seen this work, but this is Doc Edgerton in 1964, took this picture using, was it a millionth of a second shutter or frame rate, and then recently Ramesh has been working on computational imaging to try to get to a trillion, or he got to trillion frames a second. So when you get to trillion frames a second, you can start to see light moving across space. So this is actually a light slowed down by 10 billion times. But what's really interesting is when sort of, and this springs directly from the core competence of SIGGRAPH, is when you start to really merge computation and optics and thinking about things like human factors. There's obviously you can do some interesting experiments like this, and over in our booth you can see some of the other work that Ramesh is doing. But it ties in directly with the next PI I want to talk about, which is Ed Boyden was actually, he did his work at the Media Lab and then went and got a biology PhD and came back and was looking for a place. No one would hire him. And we said, well, why don't you come back to the Media Lab and do wet lab here? So he was, I think, the first in doing that. So he works on synthetic neurobiology, and one of the things that he's trying to do, where he says ground truthing life and understanding science, we do a lot of biology with assumptions about how things work when we only know what's going on at the cellular level. So understanding and imaging more and more and more gives you a kind of ground truthing. What are the molecules doing behind the cells? How do we, so for instance, and this is a direct application of the work that all of you and Ramesh have been working on. So by taking, so as you know, microscopes are sort of horribly two-dimensional, right? And so by using something like light field imaging, you can suddenly turn microscopes into 3D that allow you to capture whole animal 3D microscopy. So this is, so C. elegans is the only creature where we have a full connectome, where we know all the connections between all the neurons. It's 302 neurons, 7,000 connections. But we were able to image it in 3D up to 50 hertz. This is a 5 hertz thing. It doesn't actually move that fast. So you don't actually need to go 50 hertz unless it's walking. This is standing still, so this is at 5 hertz. But what's interesting is by doing this imaging and understanding how the timing works and what's happening in 3D, we can much better understand than just having the connectome. The connectome is kind of like having a street map of LA. This is like being able to see what people are talking about in the cars as they drive around. So we're getting to lower and lower levels that actually help us in things like drug discovery and understanding the brain. This is more work. This is the brain of a zebrafish larva. But this kind of technology is interesting because normally computational optics engineers didn't hang out with neuroscientists, but by bringing them together, we're able to do this kind of work, which is extremely important. And then the last group I wanted to show you is mediated matter, which is Neri Oxman's group. And she's originally an architect, and she did a lot of work in materials science. So this is her world with additive manufacture, material engineering, synthetic biology, and she did computational design as an architect. But she sort of brings this all together in a very elegant way. And this was in collaboration with a bunch of different people. So first she starts out with 2 bacteria. So cyanobacteria is the bacteria that you find in ponds and stuff that converts light and photosynthesizes it and creates sucrose, sugar. And the other bacteria is modified E. coli, which can take the sugar and turn it into whatever you design the E. coli to do. So these 2 bacteria don't typically meet in nature, but by putting them together and synthesizing E. coli, which we know pretty well how to do, you can create a photosynthetic driver for a whole bunch of materials that you might want to make. And then using growth algorithms that are based on sort of this recursive growth patterns, she was trying to figure out what the shape of the container should be. And what you want to make it hollow so that we could actually route the fluids through them. And again, her idea is this is wonders, so people going into space. So this is sort of slightly more the art side, but she wanted to make it a wearable thing. So a wearable thing that has an ability to deal with 2 kinds of bacteria, allow photosynthesis, and allow some fluid, microfluidics. And then luckily, 3D printers these days have gotten better. So I think this is over 50 meters of material when it's totally stretched out. And I think what's important is also the computational design part. I think that understanding what works and adding the parameters of both the individual, of the bacteria, and being able to sort of iteratively create a computational design based on what you need. And so now they're just injecting some of the fluid to make sure that the fluids work. And so there are some parts that are millimeter thin, thick, and then some parts that are a couple of centimeters. But this is just sort of testing the fluid through the system. And this part, I think we're just using some bioluminescent material, not the cyanobacteria itself. So obviously some of it's a little bit abstract in art, but it actually is also functional. And so it's also an interesting test because we're actually trying to see how these two bacteria interact. Those are little pockets where you might feasibly pick up the fuel that's being created by the E. coli. So just, I think about a month ago, I was in a meeting with some sponsors, and Nicholas Negroponte was there, and we were talking about all the stuff we're interested in, and he said, bio is the new digital. And from the guy who wrote the book, Being Digital, it was kind of interesting, because it's sort of both metaphorically and at some level literally. And I think what's interesting is if you think about kind of all of the work that you have been doing here in terms of taking the power of computation and art and pointing it at a lot of the issues about doing rendering photorealistic images and trying to figure out how to simulate physics. This is exactly what they're trying to do in biology now, right? How do you simulate a human brain inside of a computer? How do you then use that to deal with the real world? It's different, but the type of people it's attracting is very similar. If you look at the synthetic biology lab at MIT, most of the people who work there are computer scientists. And so there's definitely a lot that I think a lot of overlap and possibly something that might come together where you will see the convergence of the tools. So I mean, I think a great example is Autodesk. All their tools now are starting to develop where they're designing biological devices as well as computer graphics devices. So I think at the technical level, there's a lot of similarity. I'd be very curious to see what the contribution across these disciplines would be. And I do feel like very much like 30 years ago when I used to run around saying, well, the internet's going to affect you. And I remember exactly there was a room full of newspaper people, and half the people fell asleep and half the people walked out. And I said, the internet's going to affect your business. They said, there's only a coffee pot with a camera pointed at it on the internet. How does this affect my business? Well, it eventually did. I think that biology will pretty quickly affect everyone's business in some way. And it's, I think, and the good news is kind of like the internet, it's actually getting easier to understand. It's looking more and more, it's not exactly the same as computer science, but it looks a lot more like computer science than the biology you learned in high school. So I would definitely suggest taking a look at some of the problems that we're being challenged by at computer graphic, in biology, and I would guess that your brains would figure it out very quickly. So I sort of come back to this slide, which is, I do think that your ability to sort of pull these four things together, and it doesn't have to be biology, but I do think that as the speed of change increases, as the cost of innovation diminishes, as the world gets complex, you can't afford to just be one of these. You have to kind of be all of these. And I think as a community, SIGGRAPH has been really good at that. And not to derail SIGGRAPH's focus on computer animation, computer graphics, I think that's really important. I do think that having an interesting overlap with some of the adjacent communities that have a lot of the similar needs, that have this kind of ethos, might be fruitful. And we're doing this. I mean, the great thing about being an academic institution with a 2-year master's is that every 2 years students graduate, and then you get new ones, and the new ones can be sort of, they're your engine, so you can sort of steer the tanker a little bit more than a typical company because the students are coming in with fresh ideas and fresh know-how. But I do think that this is a fascinating time for all of us, and for all of you, the academics here. I do think that you don't necessarily have to. Antidisciplinary sounds a little bit aggressive and negative, but I think that these attempts to just do interdisciplinary work are still a little bit slow and old-fashioned, and thinking about how can you really mash this together and make students responsible for being in all of these quadrants. I think that's an important step that we need to take. And with that, I'm going to end and take questions. So if anybody who doesn't want to come up and ask a question, you can just tweet me and I will try to reply. But I'd love your feedback on that sort of Krebs cycle thing. I'd love your feedback on especially anything that you don't agree with what I said.